Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is one that's dear to my heart, the science of parapsychology. With me is Dr. Dean Radin, who is a past president of the Parapsychological Association and also president-elect. He is the author of The Conscious Universe, currently works at a think tank in Silicon Valley in California. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, many people think of parapsychology as having to do with channeling, aura reading, crystals, tarot cards, and popular psychic phenomenon. I don't think that it's often clear to the general public that scientific parapsychology is a full-blown scientific discipline.
Well, that's true. And of course, the problem is sustained by telephone books, for example, where if you look under the yellow pages for parapsychologists, what you find are psychic readers. And when you go further and you look into how the entertainment business has portrayed parapsychology and what even popular skeptical writers have written about parapsychology, what most people see if they're doing a quick survey is entertainment or bunk or something which is not science.
How would you characterize your work?
Well, actually, I don't really like the term parapsychology because it automatically pushes it outside the realm of a standard discipline with the use of the word para. So when people ask what I do, I often say that I'm a psychologist or I'm an engineer, because I'm both, and I study psychic phenomena. That's what I do. So since I've been trained in conventional disciplines, I'm using the tools of science to study these unusual effects. So scientific parapsychology is taking the tools of science and applying it to unusual phenomena, some of which may be thought of as psychic and some of which may not be.
The classical definitions of psychic phenomenon from a parapsychological point of view are basically extrasensory perception and psychokinesis.
That's right. And also precognition, and then there's some subclasses like out-of-body experiences, possibly, near-death experiences, possibly, possible survival of bodily death. All of those also fit under the category of scientific study of unusual events. And the events in these cases are what people talk about. So it's really a behavioral science.
Now, on either side of the scientific discipline, there are, I guess I would call them fringe groups. You have paranormal practitioners on the one hand who have all sorts of claims that they will make to promote their own practices. And on the other hand, you have the community of skeptics who are very vocal about saying, characteristically, there isn't a shred of evidence that any of this stuff is real. And your job, I guess, is to sort of walk the tightrope between these two.
Well, that's not a difficult tightrope to walk. I mean, the spectrum of opinion is so broad that on the one hand, the super enthusiasts, and on the other hand, the super skeptics are really very, very far apart. And there's a lot of room to walk in the middle. And I hope that most people are actually in the middle, that they haven't made up their mind one way or the other. As a scientist, it's actually quite easy to walk that middle road because a scientist by nature is skeptical. The whole enterprise of science is skeptical. So I doubt what I study. I'm convinced by data at times, but I'm still doubtful. And in fact, you have to be, because as soon as you drop a certain level of skepticism about what you're doing, you're not really doing science anymore.
Well, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when you say you doubt, there are some things that have been so well established in the field of parapsychology that you've stopped doubting.
Well, that's true, but there's still a little piece of doubt. What we can say is that with extremely high levels of confidence, that certain phenomena exist.
Because I know scientific research and extrasensory perception goes back now over 100 years.
That's right.
And in your book, The Conscious Universe, you review hundreds and hundreds of published scientific experiments that have yielded positive data for extrasensory perception.
Right. So we can say, after reviewing all of this data, is it likely that telepathy exists? And the answer is yes, it's very, very likely. Is it absolutely 100% sure? No, because nothing in science is absolute. So we always leave open a small probability that we might be wrong. And it is necessary. It's almost it's a way of thinking about the phenomena that's necessary. But once you make a decision that there's a very low probability of being wrong, what it does is it shifts your focus from trying to prove the phenomena, we call that proof-oriented research, into process-oriented research, where we become more interested in what is actually going on here. And that's really where the shift lies. And different scientists have different degrees of proof that they individually need in order to make that shift from proof-oriented into process-oriented research. For me, I think the proof issue is basically solved. There is proof. And so I'm more interested in process.
And of course, there's some scientists who will probably never be convinced.
That's clearly true. Some scientists will, and members of the general public as well, have such strong gut feelings about these phenomena where they feel that they're not true. There is, in essence, no amount of data, even personal experience, that will end up convincing them otherwise.
I think of it as, in some ways, a very healthy dialectic. In one respect, having a group of critics. I think parapsychology is probably the only science that has a professional group of opponents. It has in some ways sharpened the mental abilities and the quality of the research that parapsychologists do.
Well, that's absolutely true. In fact, that's demonstrably true. When you look at surveys of standard behavioral science and medical sciences and even the hard sciences like physics, the nature of the science and how carefully studies are done, parapsychology is always at the top of the methodological heap. And the reason for that is exactly what you just said, that after many, many decades of high scrutiny on every single nitpicking thing you can imagine, anybody who cares to do parapsychology today as a scientist must know that, because they also know they'll be blown out of the water if they make a mistake. And that forces the methodology to be as tight as the textbooks say that ought to be.
Now, you've been conducting experiments and publishing in the field of parapsychology for a few decades. Now, what are some of the process-oriented findings that excite you the most? What do we really know about the nature of extrasensory functioning?
Well, there's two levels to that question. One is, how does it work? It's a mechanism question, and the answer there is very simple. We don't have any idea. The second part of the question, though, is what are the factors that seem to make it work better? What are the conditions? And there, I'll give just one class of experiments in telepathy, for example. We have a suspicion, based on data, that people who have creative backgrounds, for example, musicians, especially early trained musicians, do better on telepathy tests. And that kind of matches our folklore belief about creative people in general, but the data actually supports that belief.
Well, there's a sense, especially amongst jazz musicians, when they improvise together, that it's as if they're telepathically attuned to each other.
Yeah, most groups, even classical trained orchestras and quartets, every so often get into the flow. And during that flow, no one really has a sense of the individual doing anything anymore. They feel that the group is doing something. Well, perhaps that's telepathic rapport. It's difficult to extract whatever that is versus what people talk about popularly as telepathy. So musicianship is one. Creativity in general seems to be an advantage. We know that people who report having had psychic experiences do significantly better in these experiments. We know that people who come from families that report psychic experiences also do better. So some of this you can start taking apart, well, why do these factors make any difference? A lot of it has to do with what you will allow into your world, your personal world. So since belief seems to be the filter that either allows or prevents someone to see psychic things, if your background doesn't have anything psychic in it at all, then it's very likely that your filter is set up, your internal belief filter is in such a way that you won't see it even if it's there.
Well, this is one of the arguments that skeptics use. They say, well, if I have to believe it in order to see it, it's not scientific, it's not repeatable by an independent skeptic, they would say. Only the believers seem to get the data.
But this is true in medicine, and it's true in any realm, including behavioral sciences, where the expectancy effect and experimenter's effect are known very well.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be uncomfortable to think about the fact that science is not nearly as objective as people think it is, but the fact is that what an experimenter expects to see will drive, in some sense, what they actually see. And expectancy is another way of thinking about what belief does. Belief drives your expectation.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, I'm surprised you gave me that answer. I like it, but there's even a stronger answer, though, isn't there? That the data itself supports the existence of the expectancy effect, the sheep-goat effect,
Mm-hmm.
or the belief effect to such an extent that you can predict in multiple laboratories with multiple replications that these things will occur consistently.
That's right. And so one of the strongest effects in parapsychology is the sheep-goat effect.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe it, you tend to get positive, significant scores, and if you don't believe it, you tend to get positive or significant but negative scores. So your scores will split in the direction of belief.
Suggesting that if I'm a disbeliever, that I'm actually receiving telepathic, psychic, paranormal information and then blocking it so that I score below chance.
Right. You're acting against what you know at some level.
Mm-hmm.
And you may deny that you know it because you may not in fact know it consciously.
Mm-hmm.
But because scoring rates are below chance, then we have good reason to believe that information got in there somewhere. So the total amount of evidence here in terms of belief is very strong throughout parapsychology, but it's also strong in other disciplines. So that's why, as a psychologist, I'm not all that surprised that we see lots of psychological factors building into the data itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because after all, typically we're talking about behavioral tests. And so what people believe and how they express it is part of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Let me think about that a moment. Isn't it also the case that parapsychologists have shown that skeptical researchers are likely to suppress psi functioning in their experiments?
I wish we could say that that were true, but when you look at the actual claims of skeptics, we're talking here about the extreme skeptics who claim many, many experiments, the literature does not show that.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, it's very likely that the claims of extreme skeptics that I haven't been able to ever get a significant result, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, it's untestable because we don't know where the data is.
And there are, I gather, some, well, this is a complex issue, but on the one hand, I'm thinking of a recent study in which a skeptical researcher did a study in his own laboratory, couldn't get any data, and the same exact setup brought in a parapsychologist who was known to have a positive belief system and redid the exact same experiment under the same conditions and got positive results. Then on the other hand, there are many skeptics who have done studies and evaluated the data, claimed that no, they didn't find anything, and researchers have gone over the very same raw data, redone the statistics, and found that there were significant effects.
Right, but my response is, well, why is that surprising?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not just true for parapsychology, but it's true for any other realm in which experimentation is done. And social psychologists have known this for a long time. That the attitude that an experimenter brings to a study will affect that study in profound ways. And so in parapsychology, is it more profound? Is it deeper or something than a regular psychology experiment? My suspicion is no.
Well, my sense is that amongst people in the scientific community, particularly the hard sciences, and you have an engineering background, there's a lot of resistance to the idea of the social psychologists. If you're building bridges, you will assume that the engineering principles are going to apply whether or not you believe it's a good design.
That is probably true, but I think a case could even be made within the hard sciences and within engineering that what you expect to see and what you expect to happen will in fact happen. Now obviously we're dealing with systems that are harder, they don't change as much as human beings do. So the degree of the expectation effect and belief effects within hard science and engineering may be smaller, but I'm fairly sure it's still there.
Well, I think one of the most creative contributions that you've been involved in, Dean, as a parapsychologist has been the work that's now being referred to as a consciousness field effect. Can you talk about that?
This was something that was pioneered by Roger Nelson at Princeton University. And it partially came out of the fact that over the last 3 or 4 decades, there have been many studies involving an individual and a random number generator, an electronic device which is essentially like a coin flipper.
Based on quantum mechanical principles.
Yes, most of the time, but not always. Sometimes an electromechanical device is used. Or quite literally tossing a die, anything that creates a random event. Well, it turns out that in the laboratory, we know this now with high confidence, in the laboratory, if you ask somebody to get more heads than tails, or the equivalent of that they can do it, that the system somehow acts accordingly. And we don't know why that is, but nevertheless, it's been demonstrated over and over.
In a way that's statistically measurable.
Statistically measurable, right.
Maybe not blatantly obvious.
Well, it's blatantly obvious to a statistician,
Yeah.
but it's not blatantly obvious to somebody who's naive about statistics. But nevertheless, over a long period of time, enough data has been selected or has been created in the laboratory to look at these effects so that we know that something interesting is going on. But there have been some additional anomalies associated with these experiments, which remained mysteries until Roger Nelson started to look at this. And of course, it's still a mystery in some sense, but it gave rise to new experiments. And the idea is that normally we have one random number generator. And so we're thinking about that generator and we're sending our mental beams in there and trying to change it in some way, and it does. So some experimenters started having a second generator that was hidden. It was sometimes called a silent source, which would be used, they thought, as a control. So this would be somehow hidden somewhere and we can use that as a control. And this one that we know about is the actual target. So we'd expect to see something in this explicit target and the control would behave perfectly nicely, according to chance. But what they found was that sometimes both of the generators would change in unexpected ways. Sometimes the one you were trying to change would not, and the hidden one would change a lot, statistically, significantly. So there are a number of ways of thinking about what's going on then, because it's a very curious effect. And one of the ways that I thought about was maybe intention is clearly an important element here. We're intending to change this device. But maybe the very fact of attention, the fact that I'm attending to the thing, is spreading out and it's affecting more than we normally understand. And if that were true, then attending to this device, well, I'm attending to that one too because of a field effect. So Roger did a slightly different version of this study than I did. What I did was to run a random number generator essentially in the background. That there's a group meeting or there's some television show and a generator is simply running. And what I'm keeping track of is what is the level of attention of this group? Is the group tending to be cohering among themselves, or are they all breaking up because it's time to have lunch? So you can do a minute-by-minute marking or logging of what is the group mind doing? Is it attending or not? And then later you go back and look at your random number generator output, and you can do a correlation between the attention of the group and what's happening in this random stream. And what I found a number of times now, and a number of colleagues have replicated this, that when group coherence seems to be high, which is another way of saying that their attention is high on something, anything, that the degree of randomness in the random generator changes, and it moves in the direction of more order, or randomness decreases. And when the group is scattered, their attention is scattered because it's a bathroom break or they're on lunch break or something, the random generator goes back to where you'd expect. The degree of randomness is according to chance.
And the really interesting thing to me is where this principle has been expanded on a global scale, really, when there are television events that capture the attention of the whole world, the Academy Awards presentation or the Olympics, and you have random number generators going in laboratories around the world that they seem to show some sort of a global field effect.
A field usually is thought of in physics terms as having distance effects, like it will fall off with 1 over the square root of r, and other kinds of ways of constraining where the field is. And what we don't know about in this case is what are the limits. So it seemed as though if you run an experiment of this sort during a global broadcast, that the effect of this thing probably exists everywhere on the planet. So one example is when Princess Diana died, and her funeral was several weeks later. We had a number of laboratories around the world running generators during the broadcast funeral, both before, during, and after, because we figured that hundreds of millions of people would be watching.
Probably a billion.
Perhaps a billion. And of course, none of those people knew about the fact that an experiment was taking place, but we were counting on the idea that before and after the funeral, the world focus would be less than during the funeral itself. And of course, there were some moments during the funeral that were very compelling, and so attention probably peaked. So after the funeral, we went back and analyzed all the data, and we found pretty much what we expected, which was that during the actual broadcast of the funeral, several hours long, that the amount of order in all generators around the world was statistically significant in the direction of too much order. In other words, as we kind of hoped in this experiment, perhaps a billion people all paying attention to the same thing at the same time actually did lower the amount of randomness in the world, as reflected in these random generators.
It suggests to me, to the extent that these are quantum mechanical devices, that there's something in the, one could say, the quantum mechanical foam, the substructure that underlies all of reality itself is somehow intimately connected to our own consciousness.
Yes, that's one way of looking at it, but when we start to think about what is actually going on, what is the theory, what is the mechanism, I don't think it's quantum mechanics. It might be related to quantum mechanics in some way because of strange observer effects, for example, and non-locality of quantum mechanics. But I tend to agree with Nick Herbert, the physicist, on this issue. Quantum mechanics is very good at describing the nature of the dead world, of the world of non-living matter. And it's very good at that, but it's not so good when you get into the world of living things. And we don't really understand living creatures at all very well, especially when you come up to the level of conscious awareness. And of course, that's the central mystery in quantum mechanics as well. How can the act of being conscious or being aware of something change the thing itself?
Which is called the observer effect in quantum mechanics.
That's right. So we see things that look very similar to that in parapsychology, but I would be hesitant to then say, well, we got it. Quantum mechanics is the answer. And because of this failure to link the quantum world into the world of biology, and beyond that into the world of psychology, which is where psychic phenomena show up.
Well, I recall years ago one of my professors at Berkeley, the philosopher of science, Michael Scriven, wrote an essay comparing Freudian psychology to parapsychology. And he said Freudian psychology was a theory in search of data. Parapsychology is data in search of a theory.
That's put very well, yes. We are clearly still in the stage where we have a huge amount of data. And we know certain amounts from that data. We know what exists likely and what doesn't exist. And we know something about differences among people and so on. But we're kind of in the position of perhaps 200 or 300 years ago when electrical phenomena were being studied. And there were lots of little separate facts known about electricity. And it took someone with the genius of Maxwell in order to figure out a way of mathematically representing all of it. And so in one swoop, he synthesized electricity into our modern view of electromagnetics.
Well, it's interesting to think that not so long ago we didn't have batteries, we didn't have electric motors, we just knew about lightning, pretty much.
Well, we knew about two things. We knew about lightning and we knew about static effects. And both could be produced spontaneously, and whether people understood that there was actually a connection between the two is unknown. Most people did not think there was a connection.
So parapsychology may be in more or less a similar stage of its own evolution.
I think that's exactly the stage that we're at. Well, we know lots of little facts and we don't know how to connect them into a synthesized model.
Dean Radin, it's been a pleasure reviewing what we do know about parapsychology. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.